Camille called on a Tuesday morning at 10:45. Whitfield Mercer had just finished a deposition, coffee in hand, thinking about lunch, when her name lit up his phone. He answered the way you answer your wife of 14 years, without bracing yourself. But her voice was wrong from the first word. Flat, clipped, like she was reading from a document. She told him her Uncle Gerald had died the night before. Quiet man, retired oil consultant, no wife, no children. Whitfield had met him exactly 4 times, and Gerald had left everything to Camille, the estate, the property, the accounts, somewhere between $6 and $8 million. Before Whitfield could process that, she said it, the sentence she'd called to deliver. "I need you to come home and pack your things. The divorce papers are already being drawn up." She hung up before he could respond. Whitfield stood in the hallway of his law firm in downtown Columbus, holding cold coffee, staring at his phone. He was a senior litigation partner, a man who'd put himself through Ohio State on scholarships and warehouse shifts, passed the bar on his first attempt, made partner at 38. He was not a man who folded under pressure. That fact was about to matter enormously. He and Camille had been married 14 years. They'd met at a charity dinner. She wore green, laughed at something across the room, and that was the beginning of his undoing. They bought a white colonial on Drexel Avenue in Bexley, planted a Japanese maple in the front yard, and built something that looked, from the outside, like a solid life. But the middle years had been harder than the photographs showed. 3 rounds of IVF, 2 miscarriages. The particular silence of a house where a nursery never got painted. They came out of that period differently shaped than they went in, and the distance between them never fully closed. Whitfield told himself it would. He stopped measuring it instead. In the last 3 years, the cracks had grown. Camille spent more weekends in Cincinnati. She talked about the house and his career differently, like his carefulness was a failure of imagination rather than a form of integrity. He'd tried to address it twice. Both times, she called him overanalyzing, then controlling. He dropped it. He understood now that he'd been watching the preparation for something he hadn't yet named. He sat in his office parking garage for 20 minutes before he could start the car. What kept returning to him wasn't the grief, it was the sequence. Gerald died. Estate attorney called Camille that morning. Camille called her divorce attorney. Then she called her husband. She'd been planning this. The inheritance didn't create the decision. It just gave her the moment she'd been waiting for. When he got home, Camille was at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a legal folder in front of her. She looked up, but didn't move toward him. She said she was glad he'd come straight home. He sat across from her and spent 60 seconds just reading her face, because he was a litigation attorney, and reading people was his profession. She was calm, not the sad calm of someone at peace with a painful decision, the relieved calm of someone who'd been afraid of something and wasn't anymore. The thing that had relieved that fear was money. That told him everything. He asked her to walk him through it. She said she'd been unhappy for 2 years, maybe longer, and hadn't seen a clear path forward. Now she did. He didn't beg. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up and told her that before she started calculating what this looked like, she should make sure her attorney had done a thorough review of Ohio marital property law and 14 years of financial documentation. Every contribution, every asset, every account. Camille frowned. The inheritance was hers. It had nothing to do with marital assets. He agreed, and told her everything else was a conversation. Then he went upstairs and called Sandra Cole, the best divorce attorney in Franklin County, a woman he'd referred clients to for 11 years and never personally needed until that afternoon. She cleared her schedule. Here's what Camille's attorney had apparently missed. Ohio is an equitable distribution state. The inheritance was Camille's separate property, untouchable. But the house on Drexel Avenue carried $380,000 in equity. There was a joint brokerage account with $210,000. Whitfield's 401k sat at $340,000. And critically, for the last 4 years, after they'd renegotiated their financial arrangement, when Camille took a pay cut for a director role, Whitfield had been covering the mortgage entirely on his own. Every payment, documented. Sandra's eyes moved quickly across her notepad. She looked up and said what Camille hadn't considered was that the exit was going to cost something regardless. And now that Camille had $6 million, she could actually afford to pay what was fair. That made things simpler for Whitfield, not harder. Sandra's instruction was simple. Stay in the house. Don't pack a bag. Don't vacate. Let them make the first move. So he went home and made dinner. Tuesday night chicken and roasted vegetables, the same meal he'd made for 9 years. Camille came downstairs, saw him cooking, and looked genuinely confused, like she'd expected to find an empty house. He told her dinner was at 7. She ate alone in her room. He ate at the kitchen table, reading case notes, trying not to count how many meals they'd shared at that same surface. 3 weeks later, her attorney's proposal arrived. Whitfield read it at his desk with the door closed and felt something unexpected. Pity. Not for himself, for whoever drafted the document, because it reflected a profound misunderstanding of their situation. It offered him a 50-50 split of the home equity, roughly $190,000. It ignored 4 years of single-handed mortgage payments. It assumed he would be grateful for any exit and willing to disappear quietly. Sandra's counter-response took 5 days to prepare and 12 pages to articulate, backed by complete financial records and a formal property appraisal request. It was fair. It was also, Whitfield suspected, a significant shock. The response came from Camille herself. She knocked on his home office door on a Sunday evening and sat down across from his desk for the first time since the phone call. She said she hadn't thought he'd fight. He told her he wasn't fighting. He was accounting for 14 years accurately. She asked what he actually wanted. He said he wanted the outcome to reflect what was true. He wanted to look at a settlement and feel like the years he'd given that marriage counted for something. She looked at a photo on his desk, the two of them at Yosemite, 5 years in, before everything got complicated. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen like this. He asked whether she meant the phone call or the marriage. She didn't answer. She left without another word. 2 weeks later, her attorney called to schedule mediation. His brother Nate drove up from Lancaster on a Saturday with a 12-pack and no agenda except to sit on the porch and listen. When Whitfield finished telling him everything, Nate said it slowly. "She called you at work. Not at home where you could see her face. Not after dinner where there was room for a real conversation. She called while he was in professional mode, off balance, hoping some part of his brain would process it like a transaction and comply." Whitfield hadn't thought about it that way. But the more he sat with it, the more he knew Nate was right. Camille had confused steadiness with passivity. She'd confused someone who doesn't make scenes with someone who can be dismissed. They fixed the gate latch that weekend, watched the Browns lose, ate bad pizza and talked about their father, a tool-and-die machinist who'd worked the same job for 31 years and come home every night without exception. He wouldn't have had much patience for someone calling his son at work to hand him an exit. When Nate left Sunday evening, he pulled Whitfield into one of those one-armed hugs that say more than any speech. "You're going to be fine." Whitfield already knew it. That was the strange gift of a crisis that arrives completely. It strips away all the noise and leaves you with just the clean, hard fact of what you're made of. The mediation room was everything those rooms always are. Long table, neutral art, untouched coffee, expensive silence. Camille came in with her attorney and sat across from him for the first time in a formal, lit room since everything began. She looked tired. The resolution he'd heard in that phone call had been replaced by something more complicated. Sandra presented their position methodically for 3.5 hours. Financial records, property history, contribution analysis. Camille sat very still, and Whitfield watched, because watching people was his skill, and he saw the exact moment she understood this wasn't going to resolve the way she'd imagined, the morning she inherited $6 million. During the break, they stood together at the end of the hallway holding cups of bad coffee, looking out at North High Street. She asked if he was going to make this difficult. He said no. He was going to make it honest. She asked if he hated her. He thought carefully before answering.
"He was angry," he said.
He thought she'd handled it in a way designed to put him at a disadvantage, and he didn't respect that. But he didn't hate her. 14 years is 14 years. She said she should have said something sooner. He agreed. They went back inside. By the end of the session, a settlement framework sat on the table. The proceeds from the house would be divided in a way that accounted for his disproportionate mortgage contributions, meaningfully above the original 50-50 offer. The retirement accounts were calculated accurately. The joint brokerage split reflected documented history. Sandra reviewed the numbers with Whitfield in the parking lot afterward in the November cold. He said the outcome was accurate, which meant yes, he was satisfied. Sandra told him in 22 years of family law, she'd rarely met a client who came in this clear-headed. Most people arrived devastated or enraged. He'd come in organized. He said he'd had a few days to process before calling her. She said most people don't use those days. The house sold in February. He watched the movers carry out the couch, the dining table, the bed frame they'd bought on a Saturday when they were still the kind of people who browsed furniture stores together. He felt grief, not for the marriage exactly, but for the future he'd expected to be living by now. You spend 14 years building something, and it calculates into your idea of the years ahead. When it dissolves, you have to do the quiet, slow work of recalculating. But underneath the grief was something cleaner. The pretending was over. He didn't have to wonder anymore. He moved into an apartment in Italian Village, a converted Victorian on East Russell Street, with high ceilings and real light. He furnished it slowly, buying only what he actually wanted. It was the quietest place he'd lived since law school. 6 months later, at a continuing legal education seminar in April, he ended up at a lunch table next to an estate planning attorney named Adrian, who listened to the short version of his story without interruption, which, he noted, was rarer than it should be. She asked how he'd kept his head through all of it. He said he'd focused on what was accurate, not what was flattering, not what would feel good, just what was true. She smiled at that. A real one. They exchanged cards. She called 2 weeks later about a professional referral, and they talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with referrals. He found himself looking forward to conversations in a way he hadn't in longer than he wanted to admit. There's a particular lightness, he would tell you, that comes from starting over when you know exactly who you are. Not the lightness of someone who escaped something. He didn't escape. He accounted for something. The ledger was correct, and from a correct ledger, you can move forward honestly. What Camille miscalculated wasn't his knowledge of the law, though that mattered. It was something simpler. She'd watched him be careful, steady, and agreeable for 14 years, and confused that steadiness with passivity. She thought $6 million was enough to buy her way past 14 years without a real reckoning. She thought money would make him fold. What she hadn't considered was that he had a version of himself that didn't depend on her approval to exist. He'd kept too much internal in the years when she was pulling away, thinking he was being stable when maybe he was just making himself invisible. That was a mistake he intended not to repeat. In March, weeks after closing, he drove past the house on Drexel Avenue. The lights were on inside. A young couple from Westerville, a 2-year-old, another on the way. The Japanese maple was budding, first green at the tips of the branches after a long Ohio winter. He'd planted that tree 11 years ago, Camille inside making dinner, the smell of garlic through the screen door, the satisfaction of pushing roots into prepared soil knowing something would grow. The tree was still there, just the people around it had changed. Some things take longer to grow than you expect. Some things survive winters you weren't sure you'd make it through. And some mornings you wake up in a new place with real light coming through old windows and realize that starting over from an accurate position isn't a defeat. It's the only honest way forward. His name is Whitfield Mercer. He's 43 years old. He lives on East Russell Street, in Italian Village, Columbus, Ohio. He signed those divorce papers gladly. He just made sure he signed the right ones, the ones that told the truth.